If I were to ask you who the most important person in the American economy is, you'd probably name a CEO in Silicon Valley or a politician in Washington. You'd think of the people who make the headlines. But if you want to find the real backbone of the United States, you have to look at a group of people who are almost never in the news, the nearly 8 million American workers whose jobs depend directly on trade with Canada. But what if I told you that this massive workforce is currently standing on the edge of a cliff? What if I told you that the current rhetoric in Washington, the idea that the US is a self-sufficient island that can afford to walk away from its northern neighbor, is the most dangerous economic delusion of the 21st century? Most people see Canada as a friendly junior partner, a country that is lucky to have access to the American market. But the reality is that the relationship is not a one-way street. It is a vital organ transplant. If you remove Canada from the American system, the body doesn't just get weaker, it starts to shut down. From the lights in your house to the stability of your retirement fund, the US is hardwired to Canada in ways that are almost impossible to reverse. Welcome to the hidden reality of the North American machine. This is why America can't actually afford to lose Canada. To understand the cost of losing Canada, we have to start with the jobs of the heartland. We often hear about the trade deficit with China or the threat of Mexican manufacturing, but we rarely hear about the fact that Canada is the #1 export market for 36 US states. If you live in Ohio, Illinois, or Pennsylvania, your local economy isn't just connected to Canada, it is fueled by it. Nearly 8 million American jobs, from the factory floor in Detroit to the tech hubs in Seattle, rely on the $3.6 billion in trade that crosses the border every single day. When politicians talk about cutting off Canada, they aren't just talking about a diplomatic spat. They are talking about a mass layoff event in the American heartland. 100% tariff or a border closure wouldn't just hurt Canada. It would trigger a recession in the very states that the US government is trying to protect. You cannot save American jobs by destroying the market that buys more American goods than anyone else on Earth. The vulnerability is not Canada's economy. It's the millions of American families whose livelihoods are tied to that border. And then there is the grid of necessity. Most Americans take it for granted that when they flip a light switch, the power comes on. But in large parts of the Northeast and the Midwest, that power is coming from Canada. The US and Canada are linked by a vast network of 31 major power lines that cross the border, creating a shared energy system that is the most integrated in the world. The US relies on Canadian hydroelectricity to stabilize its grid and keep prices down. But it goes deeper than just buying power. Because the grid is integrated, Canada acts as a buffer for the American system. When the US faces extreme weather or surges in demand, it often leans on the massive reservoirs of Quebec and Ontario to prevent blackouts. If the US loses Canada, either through trade wars that make energy imports prohibitively expensive or through a breakdown in cooperation, the American grid becomes significantly more fragile. You cannot build a high-tech, AI-driven economy in the US if your power supply is unstable and your electricity prices are doubling. America's energy independence is a myth if it doesn't include the energy interdependence of the North American grid. But the jobs and the power lines are just the physical infrastructure. To see the true cost of losing Canada, you have to look at the intelligence shield. For 80 years, the US and Canada have operated as a single security unit. Through the Five Eyes intelligence network and NORAD, the two countries share their most sensitive secrets and their most critical defense duties. Most people think of NORAD as a Cold War relic, but in the age of hypersonic missiles and Arctic competition, Canada is more important than ever. Canada provides the geographical depth that the US needs to detect and intercept threats before they reach American cities. If the relationship fractures, the US loses its early warning system. It would have to spend hundreds of billions of dollars to build its own redundant sensors and bases in the Arctic. Losing Canada doesn't just mean a trade war, it means a security black hole on the northern border. The vulnerability is not Canada's military, it's the fact that the US cannot defend itself alone. This brings us to the small business disaster. We often talk about trade in terms of big auto or big oil, but the US-Canada relationship is the lifeblood of American small and medium-sized enterprises. Thousands of American companies with fewer than 500 employees rely on Canada as their first and most important international market. For a small manufacturer in Wisconsin or a software firm in New York, Canada is the training wheels for global trade. It's where they learn to export, where they find their first partners, and where they generate the revenue that allows them to grow at home. If you cut off Canada, you are effectively strangling the American entrepreneurial engine. The result isn't just a loss of revenue, it's a loss of the next generation of American industrial giants. The vulnerability is not the big three automakers, it's the thousands of small thousands that make up the American economy. Finally, we have to talk about the cost of replacement. The America First argument is that if we lose Canada, we can just make it ourselves. But this ignores the reality of geological and economic scarcity. You cannot make potash. You cannot make uranium. You cannot make the specialized heavy crude that American refineries were built to process. Replacing Canadian imports with domestic or alternative sources would take decades and trillions of dollars. It would require building new mines in protected areas, retrofitting thousands of factories, and finding new suppliers in unstable parts of the world. In the meantime, the American consumer would be hit with a tariff tax on everything from food to fuel. So, why is the rhetoric of not needing Canada so loud right now? Because it's easy to win a political argument with gross numbers. It's easy to say, we are bigger, so we win. But the US economy is not a single block of wood. It is a complex clockwork mechanism, and Canada is the mainspring. The United States is a global superpower that has built its entire 21st century strategy on the assumption of a stable, integrated North America. It is the foundation that allows the US to project power in the Pacific and the Atlantic. If that foundation cracks, the entire structure of American power begins to wobble. The US can't afford to lose Canada because Canada is the secret ingredient in American exceptionalism. It is the partner that provides the energy, the minerals, the food, and the security that allows the US to be a superpower. The next time you hear a politician talk about America standing alone, don't look at the flags. Look at the power lines. Look at the freight trains crossing the border. Look at the millions of American workers who wake up every day to build things for the Canadian market. Because in the end, the biggest mistake America can make is thinking that its strength comes from its isolation. The reality is that America's strength comes from its integration. And losing Canada would be the most expensive mistake in American history. The US and Canada are not just neighbors. They are a symbiotic organism. And as any biologist will tell you, when you try to separate a symbiont from its host, neither one survives for long.